Hollywood's golden age glittered with perfection, flawless faces, graceful movements, and voices that seemed to defy pain. But behind those dazzling smiles and camera-ready poise, many of the era's biggest icons were fighting silent battles their fans never saw. Some lived with hidden disabilities that shaped every scene they filmed, every word they spoke, every step they took. They weren't just stars, they were survivors of a ruthless industry that worshipped beauty and punished weakness. These are the untold stories of legends who shone the brightest while quietly breaking inside. Here are 18 Golden Age stars who hid serious disabilities. Peter Sellers. Peter Sellers could become anyone. A bumbling inspector, a mad scientist, a clueless general, but behind his thousand faces was a man who could barely stand to be himself. The world saw him as the greatest comic actor of his generation, the genius behind The Pink Panther and Dr. Strangelove, yet Sellers' body and mind were constantly betraying him. He suffered from severe heart disease, the result of a massive heart attack in 1964 that technically killed him for 2 whole minutes before doctors brought him back. That near-death experience haunted him for the rest of his life. It left him physically weak, erratic, and increasingly dependent on medication. But even before that, he lived with crippling depression and an undiagnosed personality disorder that made him unstable, obsessive, and often cruel to those he loved. His heart condition became his silent cage. Every film, every laugh, every outburst carried the weight of a man racing against time. His final heart attack took his life in 1980 at just 54, and the world lost a man who made millions laugh but could never heal the sadness beating quietly inside him. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich was the definition of allure, a smoky voice, sculpted cheekbones, and an elegance that could silence a room. On screen, she was untouchable, the mysterious siren who bewitched audiences in Shanghai Express and The Blue Angel. But behind the satin gowns and spotlight, Dietrich's body was breaking down long before the camera stopped rolling. During World War II, she performed tirelessly for Allied troops, often in harsh conditions. Those years of travel, heavy costumes, and performing in dangerous zones left her with permanent leg and back injuries. By the 1970s, she was suffering from crippling arthritis and nerve damage so severe she could barely walk. Still, she refused to show weakness. On stage, she wore specially designed costumes that hid the braces strapped to her legs. When pain overwhelmed her, she leaned against pianos, pretending it was part of the act. Dietrich's public persona, cold, flawless, immortal, was her armor. In truth, she spent her final years in near-total seclusion, bedridden in her Paris apartment. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart's gravelly voice, sharp wit, and steely stare made him the symbol of rugged masculinity in films like Casablanca and The Maltese Falcon. To fans, he was the ultimate tough guy, a man who never flinched, never faltered. But behind that cigarette smoke and cool confidence was a hidden disability that quietly shaped his entire persona. As a child, Bogart suffered a facial injury that permanently damaged the right side of his mouth. The exact cause remains debated. Some say it came from a childhood accident, others from a Navy incident during World War I, but the result was the same, partial paralysis of his upper lip. That droop gave him his trademark sneer and slurred speech, turning what might have been a tragedy into an unmistakable signature. Off camera, though, it haunted him. Bogart was deeply self-conscious about his speech and appearance, often retaking lines when his mouth felt stiff or uncooperative. Behind his cool exterior, he was a man who had learned to turn pain into power, masking insecurity with sarcasm and charm. Later in life, another silent battle began: throat cancer. Years of smoking and drinking caught up with him, and by the 1950s his voice became weak and painful. Yet, he kept acting, kept smiling, kept being bogey until he couldn't anymore. Bette Davis. Bette Davis was fire-wrapped in elegance, a woman who didn't just act, but devoured every scene she entered. With those piercing eyes and defiant energy, she ruled Hollywood's golden age, giving unforgettable performances in All About Eve and Jezebel. But behind her commanding presence was a woman waging a long, private war against her own body. In 1983, Davis suffered a massive stroke that paralyzed the left side of her face and partially impaired her speech. For an actress whose power lived in her expression, those eyes that could slice through silence, it was a devastating blow. Soon after, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy, a trauma that left her physically weak but emotionally defiant. Most people would have retired quietly. Betty didn't. She fought her way back to acting, relearning how to speak and move on camera. She even made dark jokes about her condition, masking her pain with razor-sharp wit. Beneath the makeup and confidence, though, her body ached, her hands trembled, her energy drained, and the mirror reflected a woman who had given everything to the art that no longer loved her back. James Cagney. James Cagney was Hollywood's original live wire, quick-talking, fast-moving, and bursting with energy. Whether he was smashing a grapefruit in The Public Enemy or dancing down the White House steps in Yankee Doodle Dandy, Cagney's intensity lit up every frame. To audiences, he seemed unstoppable, a tough guy who moved like lightning. But behind the charisma and rhythm was a man silently battling the one thing that defined him most: his body. Throughout his career, Cagney struggled with chronic pain and neurological tremors that affected his balance and movement. In his later years, doctors believed he was showing early signs of Parkinson's disease, the very illness that eventually made walking, speaking, and even smiling difficult. Long before his diagnosis, he hid his symptoms through sheer willpower and choreography, adapting his movements to disguise stiffness and weakness. The actor who made dancing look effortless was, in truth, fighting against his own muscles. By the late 1950s, he began withdrawing from public life, retreating to his farm in New York, where he lived quietly and painted. But his pride never let him admit defeat. Cagney's toughness wasn't in his fists or his famous swagger. It was in the way he refused to let illness steal his spirit. Even as his body betrayed him, James Cagney remained the heartbeat of grit itself. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford built herself from nothing, a poor girl from Texas who clawed her way to the top of MGM and became one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. Every movement, every glance, every word was controlled, rehearsed, and perfect. On screen, she was untouchable, bold, sensual, and unbreakable. But behind that fierce perfection, Joan Crawford was a woman living in quiet, constant pain. Crawford suffered from rheumatoid arthritis, a chronic autoimmune disease that attacked her joints and caused excruciating pain throughout her body. In her later years, the disease worsened, leaving her fingers gnarled and her movements stiff, a cruel irony for a woman once celebrated for her grace and poise. She also developed a degenerative spine condition that made it difficult to walk or stand for long periods. Yet, she kept performing, forcing herself through the pain with iron discipline. Ever obsessed with control, Crawford hid her condition from the public. She wore long sleeves and gloves to conceal her swollen hands, and posed carefully for photographs so no one would see how frail she had become. Her drive for perfection turned into isolation, a desperate attempt to preserve the image of Joan Crawford, the legend, even as Lucille LeSueur, the woman beneath, was breaking down. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper was the quiet heart of classic Hollywood, tall, stoic, and effortlessly noble. In films like High Noon and Sergeant York, he embodied integrity itself, the man who stood alone, spoke little, and always did what was right. To audiences, he was strength made human. But behind the calm, heroic mask, Gary Cooper was battling hidden ailments that shadowed him for much of his life. Throughout the 1950s, Cooper suffered from severe stomach ulcers and chronic back pain, the result of years of horseback stunts, action scenes, and the physical toll of his early westerns. He was a man too proud to complain, so he carried the pain quietly, popping painkillers, hiding discomfort, and finishing scenes long after his body told him to stop. But beneath the surface, something far deadlier was growing. By 1960, doctors diagnosed him with prostate cancer that had already spread to his bones and lungs. True to his nature, Cooper refused to let the world see his suffering. He continued attending events, smiling for cameras, and reassuring friends with that same calm, steady voice that had comforted millions on screen. Even when he could no longer stand without help, he insisted that he was fine, just a little tired. He died in 1961 at 60. Hollywood mourned its quiet hero. Gary Cooper bore pain with dignity, turning suffering into strength until the very end. Katharine Hepburn. Katharine Hepburn was the embodiment of independence, sharp-tongued, fearless, and unapologetically herself. With her tailored trousers, quick wit, and fierce intelligence, she shattered Hollywood's idea of what a woman should be. But behind her commanding voice and graceful movements, Hepburn lived with a lifelong neurological disorder that tested her strength every single day. From her early 40s, Hepburn began showing symptoms of what was later identified as essential tremor, a disorder that caused her head and hands to shake uncontrollably. At first, she hid it skillfully, keeping her hands clasped in interviews or using props on camera. But as the condition worsened, it became impossible to conceal. Her trembling voice, once mistaken for age or emotion, was a sign of a battle she quietly fought for decades. Hollywood's perfection machine might have crushed another woman, but not Hepburn. She turned her tremor into part of her character, refusing to let it end her career. In her later films like On Golden Pond, she leaned into her vulnerability, transforming what could have been weakness into depth and authenticity. Off-screen, she stayed active, swimming daily, hiking and gardening, refusing pity or rest. She once said she never lost sight of the fact that just being is fun, and she lived by it. Katharine Hepburn had 4 Oscars for fearless roles. She proved that true strength isn't in appearing perfect, but in standing tall even when your own body shakes. Spencer Tracy. Spencer Tracy was one of Hollywood's greatest actors, a man whose performances in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Captain Courageous, and Boys Town felt so real, so human, that audiences forgot they were watching a performance. On screen, he was strong and steady. Off screen, he was a man in constant war with his body and his mind. From a young age, Tracy struggled with lifelong alcoholism, a condition that nearly destroyed his career more than once. The drinking was not born of arrogance or vanity. It was self-medication. He lived with type 2 diabetes, diagnosed in the 1930s when treatment was primitive and brutal. The illness caused fatigue, dizziness, and frequent hospital stays. Yet Tracy kept working, delivering flawless performances even when he could barely stand between takes. Behind the scenes, his health collapsed piece by piece. His eyesight dimmed, his heart weakened, and his nerves were ravaged by both diabetes and years of drinking. Katharine Hepburn, his longtime partner, often cared for him in private, hiding how frail he had become. When cameras rolled, he came alive, precise, soulful, and deeply human. He died in 1967, just days after finishing Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. He was an icon, a star, a man who gave everything he had until there was nothing left to give. Judy Garland. Judy Garland was the girl who made the world believe in magic, the child who sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow and became the beating heart of Hollywood's golden age. But behind that angelic voice and radiant smile was a woman slowly torn apart by the very system that created her. From the time she was 13, studio executives put her on a brutal regimen of amphetamines and sleeping pills, drugs meant to keep her awake for filming, and then knock her out for a few hours of rest. Those pills destroyed her metabolism, her mental health, and her sense of self. What began as studio discipline became a lifelong addiction. Garland lived with severe depression, anxiety, and an eating disorder, all hidden behind the glittering image of MGM's perfect girl. As she grew older, her body paid the price. Years of drug dependency left her frail, shaking, and emotionally volatile. Her voice, that soaring, once perfect instrument, began to waver. Yet even then, she performed with breathtaking honesty, pouring every ounce of pain into her music. Offstage, she was a woman fighting exhaustion, heartbreak, and financial ruin. In her final years, Garland often joked about her troubles to mask them, but the truth was tragic. Hollywood's brightest star had been dimmed by its own cruelty. When she died at just 47, the world mourned not just a legend, but a wounded soul who sang through her pain and made the world believe in dreams anyway. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was Hollywood's wildest hero, the charming rogue who leapt from ships, wielded swords, and stole hearts in Captain Blood, Robin Hood, and the Seahawk. To millions, he was the perfect man, athletic, fearless, and larger than life. But behind that dazzling grin and reckless charm was a body wrecked by illness, injury, and excess. Flynn suffered for years from chronic pain and a rare heart condition that left him weak and dizzy, though he often masked it with bravado. His daring stunts and non-stop lifestyle only made things worse. Countless injuries from fencing and on-set accidents left him with damaged spinal discs and nerve, pain that haunted him for the rest of his life. In private, Flynn lived with severe alcoholism and what doctors now suspect was cirrhosis and early heart disease. By his 40s, he was physically decades older than his age. His hands trembled, his face puffed, and the once agile adventurer could barely make it through scenes without fatigue. Still, he refused to slow down, insisting he was fine, joking that he had the heart of a lion and the liver of a moth. behind the myth of the eternal playboy was a man terrified of fading, of losing the vitality that defined him. When he died at just 50, an autopsy revealed his heart and organs were those of an 80-year-old man. Errol Flynn lived fast and burned so brightly that his body simply couldn't keep up with his legend. Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth was the dream of the 1940s, a vision of fire and silk. The woman whose dance in Gilda made her Hollywood's ultimate symbol of desire. With her red hair, smoldering eyes, and effortless grace, she was the fantasy every man wanted and the woman every girl wanted to be. But behind that glamour, Rita was fighting a battle no one could see, one that would slowly erase everything she had ever been. In her early 40s, Rita began showing signs of early-onset Alzheimer's disease, though for years, doctors misunderstood it as alcoholism or emotional instability. She forgot lines on set, missed appointments, and became confused by simple conversations. The press labeled her difficult, unaware that her mind was quietly slipping away. As her memory faded, so did her career. She withdrew from public life, humiliated and heartbroken, trying to understand what was happening to her. Her daughter, Princess Yasmin Aga Khan, later revealed that Rita would look at old photographs of herself and whisper, "Who is that beautiful girl?" not realizing it was her. When doctors finally diagnosed her in the early 1980s, Rita Hayworth became one of the first public faces of Alzheimer's awareness. Her suffering helped change how the world saw the disease. The woman once known as the love goddess lost her memories, but not her grace. Even in her final years, her gentle spirit remained. Frank Sinatra. Frank Sinatra was the sound of cool, the velvet voice that could melt heartbreak into melody. To the world, he was old blue eyes, untouchable, magnetic, and endlessly confident. But behind that swagger and flawless phrasing was a man battling hidden pain, both physical and emotional, that haunted him throughout his glittering career. In his early 30s, Sinatra developed vocal cord hemorrhages that nearly ended his career. His voice cracked and weakened, forcing him into silence for months, a terrifying ordeal for a man whose identity lived in sound. Many believed his career was finished, but Sinatra fought back, rebuilding his technique and lowering his range, turning what could have been tragedy into the smoky, mature tone that defined his later music. Beyond that, Sinatra lived with chronic back pain from a neck injury he sustained while filming From Here to Eternity, and decades of anxiety and depression he rarely spoke about. Those who knew him said he could go from charming and generous to withdrawn and explosive in minutes, a reflection of a man wrestling with deep inner turmoil. Later in life, he developed dementia and bladder cancer, forcing the once vibrant icon into seclusion. But even as his memory faded, people close to him said he still hummed his favorite tunes under his breath. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor was the very definition of Hollywood royalty. Stunning, scandalous, and larger than life. With those famous violet eyes, jet black hair, and a voice that could melt steel, she was the kind of star who made the world stop and stare. From National Velvet to Cleopatra, she embodied beauty and power like no other. But behind that dazzling facade was a woman who endured unimaginable physical pain and somehow turned it into grace. Taylor's health struggles began almost as soon as her fame did. Born with a spinal deformity, she suffered chronic pain throughout her life. At just 12, while filming National Velvet, she was thrown from a horse and fractured her back, an injury that would torment her for decades. By her 20s, she was already enduring surgeries, medications, and frequent hospitalizations. Over her lifetime, she faced more than 30 major operations, spinal fusions, hip replacements, and surgeries for skin cancer, pneumonia, and even a brain tumor. She was diagnosed with scoliosis, osteoporosis, and severe spinal issues that often left her bedridden. But Elizabeth Taylor refused to let illness define her. Between hospital stays, she gave the world unforgettable performances in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Cleopatra, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, roles that mirrored her own emotional and physical intensity. Yet, perhaps her greatest role was off-screen. Her constant battle with pain made her deeply compassionate. In the 1980s, when HIV/AIDS patients were shunned and silenced, Taylor used her global fame to fight for them. She co-founded the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation, raising millions and giving voice to those who had none. In her final years, confined to a wheelchair and breathing through an oxygen tube, she never lost her sparkle. Her laughter still filled rooms. Her diamonds still glittered, but it was her resilience that truly shone. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas was the face of strength. the cleft-chinned gladiator who roared through classics like Spartacus, Paths of Glory, and Champion. He was pure fire and ambition, a man who fought his way out of poverty and into Hollywood immortality. But behind the commanding voice and iron will, Douglas lived through one of the most devastating disabilities an actor could face, one that nearly silenced him forever. In 1996, at the age of 79, Douglas suffered a massive stroke that left him with severely slurred speech and partial paralysis. For a man whose entire life depended on his voice, that fierce, booming, defiant sound, it was a cruel twist of fate. Doctors doubted he'd ever speak clearly again. Many thought he would quietly fade from public life. But Kirk Douglas wasn't built to quit. He underwent intense speech therapy, determined to regain his words, even if it took years. When he returned to the stage at the 1996 Academy Awards to a standing ovation, struggling through his speech but beaming with pride, it wasn't a moment of pity, it was triumph. Behind that comeback was a lifetime of pain he'd hidden. Broken bones, old injuries, depression, and survivor's guilt after a near-fatal plane crash decades earlier. Yet, every scar only made him stronger. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner was the ultimate Hollywood enchantress, wild, magnetic, and heartbreakingly beautiful. With her emerald eyes and effortless sensuality, she captivated audiences in films like The Barefoot Contessa and Mogambo. Women admired her, and the press followed her every move. But behind that breathtaking image was a woman quietly fighting a lifetime of pain and illness that fame could never cure. From her 30s onward, Gardner lived with autoimmune and circulatory issues that caused chronic fatigue and leg pain. Years of stress, smoking, and heavy drinking, her way of numbing emotional wounds, only worsened her health. By her 50s, she developed emphysema and a serious stroke in 1986 that left her partially paralyzed on one side of her body. She hid her illness as long as she could. When her face began to swell from medication and her once smooth voice turned raspy, she stopped appearing in public. Friends said she refused interviews because she didn't want anyone to see her ruined. But even in private, she never lost her humor. Ava Gardner was a woman of astonishing grit, one who faced physical decline with the same fiery spirit that made her unforgettable. Montgomery Clift. Montgomery Clift was the very image of vulnerability, a man whose eyes seemed to ache with emotions too heavy for words. In A Place in the Sun, From Here to Eternity, and The Misfits, he redefined masculinity in Hollywood, proving that strength could exist in sensitivity, and beauty could carry pain. But behind those haunted eyes was a man who lived in torment, not only of the heart, but of the body. In 1956, after leaving a party at his close friend Elizabeth Taylor's house, Clift's car careened into a telephone pole on a winding Beverly Hills road. The impact was devastating. His face was crushed, jaw broken, nose split, cheekbones shattered. Taylor arrived moments later, pulling his broken teeth from his throat to save him from suffocation. The accident left him with nerve damage, partial facial paralysis, and chronic pain that never went away. The man once hailed as the most beautiful actor in Hollywood could no longer recognize himself. Though surgeons painstakingly rebuilt his face, the damage ran deeper. He developed tremors, speech difficulties, and a haunting stiffness on camera that mirrored the pain within. Yet, he refused to quit. Clift threw himself into his craft with a kind of holy desperation, channeling every ounce of pain into roles that felt almost too real. His performance in Judgment at Nuremberg stands as one of cinema's most haunting portrayals of trauma and guilt because it was real, but the pain consumed him. Addicted to painkillers, alcohol, and self-loathing, Clift spiraled. He died at just 45, a symbol of a man who never stopped trying, Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier was often called the greatest actor who ever lived, the man who could command a stage or screen with nothing more than a look, a pause, a perfectly measured breath. From Hamlet to Wuthering Heights, he brought Shakespeare's poetry and human frailty to life with unmatched brilliance. To the world, Olivier was immortal, the flawless craftsman, the god of classical acting. But behind the curtain, he was a man locked in a long, losing battle against his own body. By his 50s, Olivier's health began to crumble. Years of relentless work, smoking, and stress left him with chronic lung disease, which sapped his stamina and voice. Soon after, he was diagnosed with dermatomyositis, a rare autoimmune disorder that inflames the skin and weakens the muscles. The once vigorous performer grew frail. His face puffed from steroids, his limbs trembled, and even walking or speaking became painful. Yet, Olivier refused to retreat. He continued to perform, sometimes propped up by assistants, sometimes forgetting lines mid-scene, but always finishing the show. His portrayal of King Lear and his later television roles were miracles of sheer willpower, driven by pride and passion. Privately, though, he was terrified, not of death, but of decline. To lose control of his craft was, to him, a kind of dying. He worked on, often through exhaustion and pain, driven by a fear of being forgotten, and a need to prove that the artist still lived within the failing body. In his later years, as tremors and memory lapses worsened, Olivier remained dignified. His last role wasn't performed for applause, but for courage. The courage to keep creating, even as the body gave way, and the legend stood taller than the man himself. Hollywood once sold perfection, flawless faces, golden lights, and effortless charm. But these stars proved that behind the glamour were fragile, brilliant souls who fought battles the audience never saw. They smiled through pain, performed through tremors, and turned their scars into art that still moves the world today. They weren't just beautiful, they were brave. Which of their hidden struggles moved you the most? Tell us in the comments below. And if you love this deep dive into old Hollywood's untold truths, remember to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because next time, we're revealing even more secrets behind the silver screen.